Hello, everybody. Welcome to Igor Sikorsky Kyiv Polytechnic Institute, our School of Sociology and Law and Department of Sociology. I am Pavlo Fedorchenko-Kutuyev, and today we are having the second day of our conference devoted to historical sociology of Max Weber and Weber-Wallerstein, their ideas on the dynamics of state and world systems. And I'm happy to welcome our today's keynote speakers. I can see Professor Marek Rimza from Poland, Dr. Maria Tищенко of Poruch, nearby international NGO, and Nіколя Ембер, his PhD candidate in sociology. And Nіколя opens our conference, the second day of our conference today, and he's going to talk about researcher in time of war, the dilemma of neutrality and accessibility to research site, extremely important and topical issue. Nіколя, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Дуже дякую за запрошення. I will just share my screen.
Just a second, hold just a sec. Yeah, here you go.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Just a moment. Up. Okay. Okay. No, that's not this one. Okay. Excuse me, just I'm trying to show my presentation.
That's fine, take your time.
Okay, we will do in another way. Okay. 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 Just taking my notes. Okay, so before it loads, I would like today to speak about the researcher in time of war, and especially the dilemma of neutrality, which is implied by the research activity, and also the accessibility to research sites. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm just trying to take my notes. Okay. Okay, we'll try like this. Okay, that's okay, great. Okay, do you see my slide when I want to change it? Do you see it? Yeah.
Yes, everything's perfectly fine.
Okay, great. So my introduction, I would like to say that first of all, the researcher work is to observe and analyze society as a scientific object without applying to it our own conceptions of the world, or own values, or own interpretations, one's beliefs. It is hard to say and understand to what extent such a role embodies the researcher is possible, especially in time of war. I would like just to say that I'm going to take in account one specific approach of researches in time of war. This is a composite approach, which was developed by the researcher Barakat in the beginning of our century. And so what is this approach? This approach tends to understand, to how can I say, to implement different techniques and flexible methods to collect and analyze the research object. That is to say, traditionally you have three ways to collect data, to collect materials for your research. You have the first one, this is the experiment one approach. The second one is the survey approach. And the third one is ethnographic approach. But in time of war, as the conditions are all the time changing and completely unpredictable, you have to change your approach and to use a lot of techniques and methods, because you have to adapt yourself all the time. So this is I would like to stress that this is my point today, to speak about this composite approach and how it could help the researcher in time of war to conduct research. Could you see my slide about the creation of the methodological relevance? Do you see it? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
You can see it? Okay, great.
Yes.
So first of all, I would like to speak about the creation of the methodological relevance of conducting research in time of war. Because traditionally, you have a lot of researchers which stress that conducting a research during war is very dangerous and is a big risk for the researcher. The problem in time of war is to be able to evaluate all of the unpredictable parameters during war, and to evaluate the possible outcomes from the research. Because if you take a risk for your own life, but you can't get any outcomes from your social, for instance, from your sociological researches, it's not useful for the sciences. So I would like to say that first of all, some of the realities which embodies a war as regards the research. First of all, the war is a complex phenomenon with unpredictable parameters which contradicts the rules of any empirical and methodological traditional approach for the researcher. Because any theoretical frame, and especially selecting a coherent sampling, is unlikely to be feasible, okay? Because of the unpredictable conditions in a region affected by war. Any qualitative research is not determined by qualitative criteria, but only by its practical feasibility. So these realities coming from the war are coming, I forgot to say, it's coming from the works for Barakaat. This is a collective group who worked this first one article, because my lecture is essentially based on these two articles. The first one is the composite approach from Barakaat, and the second one, it's about the ethical principles from Jonathan Goodhand for conducting research in time of war. So the second point is also the psychological and traumatic conditions of the people, because when you have people who are suffering because of the war, these traumatic conditions could be a break for any research outcomes, because people can be inhibited and paralyzed because of the trauma of the war. So any research would be in such a case useless and even sometimes counterproductive. So this is the second point, which is often used as being a reason to not conduct research in time of war. The third point is that even though people would be ready to speak to the researcher, they would be looking for any kind of sense or interpretation of all the social realities which are occurring. I mean, like, of the current events, which are seen as threatening and confusing for people. So it means like that there are some speculative interpretation which could be done during the war, and this is not always a faithful image of the reality. It doesn't reflect the reality. And the my fourth point is also the fact that this is a very tricky question, is the accessibility and the opportunity to access territories which are under the control of both opposite sides, because any kind of research led on both sides would be considered by any camp as a betrayal and hostile act. So that's why it's any researcher who would like to conduct research on both opposite sides in time of war has to keep in mind that his research could be perceived, seen as a hostile act by the locals. So that's why there are some limits and difficulties for the researcher to conduct researches on the ground in time of war. But I would like to say that as Jonathan Goodhand noticed, Jonathan Goodhand is a politologist, a researcher, and he says that the prior position forbidding any research in a region affected by war was also a way, from an historical perspective, according to him, a lot of humanitarian organizations tried to find all of the reasons as the researchers to not conduct these researches in time of war. I'm quoting his speech, to rationalize their limited investment. That is to say that such an investment, either humanitarian, but it could be also applied for the research, would be unnecessarily risky for the people, not only for the locals, but also for the researchers and for the people who are helping. Nevertheless, if one considers the practical, methodological, and ethical aspect of the research in time of war, we could for sure think about some ways to conduct research in time of war. That's very important. So this is my second point of my my conference. I would like to speak about defining an ethical framework with the principle "do not harm" for the researchers in time of war. So it was defined by Jonathan Goodhand. So this is a very interesting point because defining an ethical framework for research in war zones is a quite tricky and difficult subject. The consensus insists on the importance of not harming people based on the humanitarian framework. But also I would like to say that it would be relevant to stress the role of the researcher in a very unpredictable situation to not change the process itself that it pretends to study. Because by his mere presence, the researcher can upset social interactions that is not supposed to have to change, but on the contrary, to observe and analyze. So that's why it's very complicated for the researcher to not change the social situation that he pretends to study. The war implies, as I said earlier, a complex process which has to be studied and to understand the metamorphoses and transformations which led to a more from a pre-war society to a post-war society. So according to k.e.n, any research conducted in areas of conflict is possible only with an in-depth understanding of the violence patterns. For instance, violence is determined according to him, spatially, temporally, or seasonally, for instance. You have an example that k.e.n is using is the war in Afghanistan. According to k.e.n, during the war in Afghanistan, it was following a seasonal pattern because violence is highly likely to occur during spring and summer. In the case of Ukraine, it is hard to define a pattern, but we could say it is highly determined spatially from a geographical point of view, as the military front is rather located in the east. For a comparative view, the Sri Lanka war was essentially concentrated in the northeast. So k.e.n also stresses the informational aspect of the war because the researcher has to think about the kind of information is he going to take or remove. So it is also a very tricky questions from a preliminary work before any consideration about the object of the research and also how we are going to conduct the research. Because the informational aspect is a tricky question because in time of war, everything is well oriented and is more or less an active participant in the conflict. So for Jonathan k.e.n, the ethical framework for any researcher should be based on the humanitarian one. Any access to the war-related areas is difficult for sure without the help of this aid organization, humanitarian organization. But before any research on the ground, the researcher has to define how he is going to conduct his research, with whom he's going to talk, and what about. Any researcher before conducting a research on the ground should ask himself, does the security risk justify and warrants any research on the area? Are there any other options to lead these researches and get the materials that he needs? This is a very important question because it is, I would say, an internal and personal evaluation from the researcher side. So the research in a conflict area supposes to develop a methodological flexibility as regards the evaluation of security risks faced with the outcomes expectation of the research, the guarantee of anonymity and confidentiality for the respondents. So this is my first point. The first point to take into account an ethical framework, do not harm. The first point is confidentiality, because the war often leads people to a kind of strategy of silence, because this is a survival reflex, because any information that could be given to a third party could lead to significant security risks for the individual, the respondent, but also for his relatives and even the wider community. So that's why the researcher in such a case, following his first principle of not to harm and do not make the situation worse, has to be very, very careful with the materials he's collecting, providing and assuring confidentiality to its respondents during and after the war. The second point is the transparency, honesty and transparency. All the respondents during the research process have to know what the purpose of the researcher is, to what extent and what for. This is also very important to keep good relationships with all the respondents on the ground who could help to speak with some key actors and locals. For instance, the aid organization, humanitarian organizations. The researcher's duty is not to disturb the actual operation of the aid humanitarian groups. That's why clear transparency and communication about the researcher goals are fundamental. My third point is also the risk of implicit messages. Due to the extreme sensitivity of the field, the researcher has to keep in mind that every deed, every word, every action, every behavior could be submitted to a lot of interpretation. Also, the research activity should not be interpreted as a way to legitimize any group which is analyzed and studied, because researchers should not be considered and seen by the parties is studying as a means of political capital and a form of political recognition. So that's why the researcher has to think about, to keep in mind these questions. Is the process of conducting research in a conflicted area likely to give a form of legitimacy to the group studied? That's very, very important to not put people in kind of interpretation and implicit messages. There is also a practical problem which could lead to some ethical problems for the researcher, because if only one side is accessible for conducting research and not the other one, it could be viewed as an ideological bias of the researcher. Any research or absence of research in conflicted areas is over-interpreted in the light of the conflict. So that's why it's very, very tricky question, because you have the first one, the fact that your research doesn't have to be considered as a way to support or legitimize any group studied. And on the other side, if you can only access to one side, it could be viewed as a way to legitimize any kind of party. My fourth point is mutual respect and consent about the discussed topics. This is a very, very important subject, because as I said earlier, some people, locals, are suffering from this strategy of silence, because the strategy of silence, what it is about, it does not concern only people who are afraid to be prosecuted if they openly speak about what they have seen. I think there is a microphone which is not turned off. Could you turn off, please, if it's not?
Yeah, please, everybody, please mute your mics. Thank you.
Thank you. So the strategy of silence is not only about people who are afraid to be prosecuted because they openly speak about what they are seeing, but also people who are psychologically harmed and are suffering from some traumas because of the war. Speaking with people about related war topics encompasses sometimes, unfortunately, to open some old wounds, which could be not beneficial for the respondents. So that's why here is the key to adapt and understand the social situation rather than applying a theoretical model constructed outside of a social understanding of the issues on the ground. The researcher has to understand that he could, by his questions, to reopen some wounds and sufferings in the life of people. That's why he has to be careful and restrain himself by assuring that every question is going to ask is based on a mutual respect and consent from the respondents. The respondents has to be aware about the questions is responding. Okay, so and my last point is anticipation and preparation. Before conducting the research, the researcher has to make a detailed analysis of all of the possible outcomes and informal interpretation and messages that could arouse the very object of his work. Because, for instance, when you conduct a research in time of war, people are going to ask you a lot of questions. Why did you come? Who are you? Where does the researcher come from? What for did he come here? And whether that's only for his research. So the researcher has to be ready to reply to all of these questions that could be aroused. Also, that's why the researcher has to be the more transparent the researcher is, the more confident he is for the respondents, whose social situation is completely unstable and in a certain way difficult also to understand. So that's why the researcher has also to assure his security, understanding all the local risk because of the war. I would like just to speak about very quickly, because we do not have a lot of time, about the digital ethnography. So what is digital ethnography? It's a new approach based on a study of human relations with and throughout digital technologies. You have a lot of ethnographies which have already been done. For instance, the one of Geneviève Bell, who worked on the links between cultural practices and technological developments. The second one, Bonnie Nardi, who studied about World of Warcraft. Or the third one, Tom Bolstoff, who created a profile on a virtual platform named Second Life, where people invent for themselves and choose for their new life an avatar, house, and so on. So just to give some points, some line of thoughts, how could digital ethnography could be applied is in the context of war. First of all, we are living in a hyper-connected world where information abounds everywhere. So the omnipresence of the digital makes it's complicated to separate the digital life and the social life, because we are living in this hyper-connected world. For instance, through the social networks, you have some platforms which are very interesting. These platforms, social networks, are very interesting to analyze, because it's the privileged place to see how the people behave, how they behave themselves, and what kind of conceptions of the world they are sharing to people. because in times of war, also people share video, talk, and express themselves during on the internet. So it could be an alternative approach because there is not the physical aspect, physical security aspect, while you have the digital security aspect, which is also very, very important. But digital anthropology allows us to study social groups and how they are formed. What are the links between the actors of a digital group, a group in the name of what, by what means do they communicate, what is the language which is used, is there a hierarchy, and so on and so on. There are for sure some limits to this approach because, for instance, you have the generational question because all people do not use often the technologies, so you can have an access to these people and their testimonies. Also, in time of war, people do not use all the time digital technologies, and so on and so on. So you have also a lot of limits with this approach. In conclusion, I would like to stress the principle and reflections of how the researcher should behave during research in time of war. If all ethnographic and sociological research assumes a basic theoretical model, it should be remembered that war as a complex phenomenon implies a certain flexibility and adaptability on the part of the researcher, but also great caution. The researcher must be balanced between adaptability and anticipation. While there are practical and methodological problems with conducting field research in times of war, for instance, studying a war can be done in different ways. We have also to understand the patterns that are at work, the violence patterns that are at work to ensure its security, to be able to anticipate the social changes during the war. But you have also, and also with this principle, which is very important, to not harm people. We said that also there is another approach which should be studied is the web ethnography. As far as I know, there are not any researchers which were lead about the links between war and web ethnography. So this is a field that could be used and to think about. This is very important to think about how could digital ethnography could be an interesting approach during a wartime. And so my last point is to stress for sure on the ethical charter. That is to say the principles that we have mentioned above, because you have to not harm people, and this ethical charter from the principles that we spoke about should guide the researcher throughout all of the process of the research. This is very important to keep in mind. All of these principles that we mentioned above, for sure they are not absolute, because there are some other values or principles that could be used, but I just wanted today to share with you my reflections about how the researcher could be useful in time of war. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikola, for your brilliant speech and extremely topical speech. It would be great if you could share your presentation with us, so we have a chance to put it on our website, thus making it available to broader audience and primarily to our students and faculty. I think it's a very novel undertaking for Ukraine in particular, because to my knowledge, we have not been talking much about the responsibility of a scholar, ethical responsibility of a scholar during the time of war. And given that we are engulfed in a full-scale war waged by Russia against Ukraine, I think it's of utmost importance. And thanks for addressing this issue, and thanks for doing this in such eloquent and novel manner. Maybe questions, suggestions, criticism, discussions. If not now, again, Maria, go right ahead. Maria, then Dr. Gennady, Dr. Maria Tищенко, and then Dr. Gennady Korozhov.
Nicholas, during your research, in general, researches during the war, it's important to have this social capital, the level of trust from the people to researcher. And how do you see how you can build this trust of your respondents?
That's a very tricky question. It depends on your approach. Either you're on the ground, either you are doing your digital, you have a digital approach. Because if you are on the ground, if you cooperate, for instance, with aid organizations, humanitarian organizations, which are here for a long time, they have built this trust between the locals and these organizations. And if you can cooperate with them, locals are likely to see you as a serious person, which could be trusted. So I think the first aspect is to keep this cooperation with the aid humanitarian organization, first one. So the second one is to implement this humanitarian ethical charter applied to the researcher work. And as regards the digital ethnography, when you are speaking, for instance, if you have a serious academic background and you show it to the people, you show that all of your researches were very serious and have been recognized by the academic world, they would be likely to, because you are becoming a kind of public person, I think people are likely to reply to your questions, especially in this case, because when you are speaking about on the internet, you do not have this, I would say, the pressure of the presence of the researcher on the ground. You do not feel yourself as being obliged to reply, because on the internet you can just remove the person from your list, and it's not going to change anything. So maybe from a digital approach, it would be easier to build a kind of trust, even though you have to be very careful, because you're not sure about with whom you're going to speak, if the person wants to speak anonymously without his identity. That's why you have you have to balance all of the plus and minus of your research. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Gennady Korozhov, then.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nikola, for your informative, really, and thought-provoking presentation. It's really good. And I agree with my colleague, Professor Fedorchenko-Kutuyev, about that for our researchers, it's very topical, really. You raised and illuminated lots of aspects of ethics in our research during the war. In my opinion, it's very important, really, about not harming, not getting risks for respondents and researchers themselves. But I'd like to raise a question which, in my opinion, is very important for all researchers and all intellectuals in the period of war, especially not simply in periods of some, territorial conflicts, but in conditions of absolutely unprovoked and aggressive war. I am talking about civil responsibility of researchers and broader intellectuals. Do you think that intellectuals must take a strong position on the issue of war, especially in conditions of such aggressive war, invasions, aggressions, like the situation we're facing currently? If or we must simply keep our voices muted and pretend to be objectivist. And in connection with that, I suppose for French society, this question is especially acute and topical. What French intellectuals have to do in this situation? And do they what they expected and they must do? What do you think? And some examples.
That's a very difficult question indeed. And the questions that you raise is my questions every day, because for sure if you're a researcher, you want to analyze from a scientific approach all of this, the society, the social phenomena, and so on. But how can you just to that's very complicated to to lead an objective research, and on the other side to mute himself, to mute yourself. I think, in my personal opinion, when you're conducting a research, for instance, you're writing an article, you're writing a PhD or so on, you have to be neutral and objective. You're just trying to analyze and observe the social changes or the social realities you want to observe and study. This is, I think, we have to keep this kind of neutrality in such a case, but only in such a case, because outside your researches, you can for sure give your opinion and say that thanks to your researches, you have understand that for instance, in your case, Russia is an aggressive state which is trying to destroy the reality of the Ukrainian nation and culture, and that we have to react. We have to react to help Ukraine. That's for sure, because when you're just looking at the situation from an historical perspective, just from an historical perspective, you can see that all the time Russia tries to implement his imperialist dream, and is that Russia didn't respect the specificities of the Ukrainian culture and try to implement, for instance, Russifications in Ukraine during the imperial times and so on. So you have a clear, how can I say, we have a clear image of what's going on now. But I think just we have to keep this objective and neutral approach during our researches, articles, and so on. But in our own lives, our personal life, we can say what we are thinking about. For instance, I would just take my example, my personal testimony. When I'm conducting my researches, I try just to analyze and observe the social realities. But in my personal life, I'm saying my point of view. I'm saying that we have to help Ukraine against this aggressive state of Russia, and so on. So it's not the opposite. I think on the contrary, it helps, because when you keep your neutral and objective approach during your researches, it helps you to keep a scientific approach, which could be more useful, I think, to help Ukraine. I think so.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again for your presentation, extremely topical one, and thank you for questions and lively debate. This is really important, and this is something we are striving for. Any more questions? Okay, if not, then I'm honored to give the floor to Dr. Maria Tищenko. Maria represents both Ukrainian NGO Poruch, which means nearby or neighbor, and Swedish International Center for Local Democracy. Maria, the floor is yours. Maria, you are muted. Your mic is muted, Maria.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for invitation to this event. And it's important that we are doing not only research, but we implement the result of the research. So I just would like to tell, yes, I'm director of NGO Poruch, and we cooperate with Pavlo's department so much, and with the teachers of this department. And it's important that the alumni of department, they are our employees, and they work for NGO as coordinators in different spheres, and mostly in mediation, which they graduate. And I'm mentor in ICLD, International Center of Local Democracy, Sweden, and we also support communities in Ukraine and in another countries. So I'm mentor in Ukraine and in Georgia, Turkey, and Bosnia. So our NGO was founded in 2011, and we have, such aim to create good conditions to develop young leaders to build our future. And many activities from 2011 were implemented due to different international organizations, and we're sharing democratic ideas within the society. And it's really visible, especially in Donbass, because from 2014, we worked as partners of International Organization of Migration and different UN missions in Ukraine, in Lugansk and Donetsk region. And we worked especially with the initiative groups, and what we see now, these groups, these initiative groups from Donetsk region, Lugansk region, they feel Ukrainian so much, and they just protect with their bodies their territory, and they don't want to leave this territory. And we have 46 members in different regions of Ukraine, almost covering all Ukraine. And we have a huge network because from 2050 we create School of Peace, and we have 600 volunteers all around Ukraine. So of course, before 24 of February, we mostly focus on gender aspects of the projects, and we work with central government, especially with Ministry of Regional Development. And we, of course, research is the main part of our decision-making, how to implement gender policy. Also, we work with Ministry of Energy Security, and as results, we have gender advisors in these institutions. Also, we worked in small communities, and especially we took part in reform of decentralization so much and developed a lot of democratic instruments together with local communities, with different governmental institutions such as school participatory budgeting, public consultations. It was participatory budgeting for all cities. So we took part in different these important democratic instruments. And of course, youth activities. So this is including international Erasmus Plus projects, and we still continue it now because it's important that our young people share their knowledge, share their experience, especially war experience abroad. So actually, we before the war, this second part of the war, because for us the war started in 2014. We did research on gender aspects and workplace gender equality in the energy sector, and we did research in 290 business energy companies, not only business but also government companies, and also through different instruments we implement gender policy in different regions of Ukraine. Then it was this is some pictures from our event, and this is the methodology of forum theater and different kinds of events. And also we worked with IDPs, internally displaced people, especially students. And from Polytechnic University, we integrate students to hosting communities where they studied. And we give them competences how to do business. And as a result, our students start their own businesses, their startups and social enterprises. And also we implement such project as School of Peace. It's short name of the project. This is, you see our schools before our repayment, and you see school after repayment. And actually in this project, alumni of Pavlo's department took part as coordinators, and still we continue our project School of Peace in unfortunately only western part of Ukraine right now. But we involve children to create these murals or even graffiti. As you see on one picture, it's graffiti. It's such provocation, art provocation, because not a lot of schools can say I have graffiti inside school. So we did this because alumni of the school support us and help us. And what we teach non-violence communication, mediation, and we did research in this project because we would like to understand how our project influence the community where these children lives. Because when you teach this mediation, violence communication, this influence could be through parents, through NGOs, through local government. So our results were amazing because we got social cohesion of our communities. The level of stress decreased, and so a lot of good results we achieved this school. So of course, we organized different round tables with scientists because we think that it's combination NGO, also scientific sphere and institutions, intellectual institution. This is what we have right now, and what is important right now, because what we have destroyed schools. 3 other schools were destroyed, and 6 our children were killed in Lugansk region. in Novo Aidar. And but what we have institutional memory. So, you know, this is what we can lose. Also, this is the picture actually from now occupied Kakhovka. We organized children camps, so with support of your students, students of Polytechnic University. And we did camps each year. We have children camps, and they study different subjects, they receive different competencies. And so this Erasmus Plus projects which we implement, and we have interns from USA, from Sweden also. And also, I don't know why it's not showing, but okay, let's try. And also we implement such activities as we did advocacy actually. It was 2 fashion shows on wheelchairs in Kharkiv and in Kyiv. And this is a picture from our school of volunteer, which we provide in Ukraine. And what we're doing now, it's very, you know, that condition for our cities is totally destroyed, and we have really huge work to do. And so we focus on humanitarian aid, especially to south of Ukraine. We did evacuation of from Ukraine to other countries, because we have a lot of partners abroad, and these partners just hosting our Ukrainians abroad. Also, we provide financial support for people in need, and cooperate with EU funds. So because we had this, you know, memory from Donbass, how to organize, and actually next day when the war started, we start online education, which called Defense of Children, because we understand that children are underground, they're afraid, they hear the sirens, but we should, you know, do something that these children should be busy. And this is actually our activities here in Malmo, because now I'm in Malmo, and we evacuate 43 people with disabilities from Kharkiv to Malmö, and 7 of them already have operation, and 7 people who didn't hear, they're deaf people, they were deaf people, but they have 10% or 30% hearing, and they right now can hear. So it's very short presentation, and this is a picture from Youth Olympic Games, where Poruch was presented, because we prepared volunteers for the Olympic Games. And I will be really glad maybe to answer your questions and to do discussion.
Thank you, Maria, for your fantastic talk, and for the work you've been doing. It is really important. And again, as I've said on a number of occasions, I think it's critically important that we combine academic comments and practical activities, that we bring together academic commentators and practitioners, policymakers. Again, this cannot be overestimated. Friends, questions to Dr. Tищенко?
Whom you give word, Pavlo? I don't know.
Okay, Dr. Korzhov and Nikola, Dr. Korzhov, and then Nikola Ember, in that order. You are muted. Gennady, you are muted.
Okay, sorry. Sorry about that. Thank you, Maria, for this inspiring, I would say, presentation, because you are a person who are actively involved in this civic activity. It's very important, in my opinion. And actually, my question is concerned with this civil activity of our citizens in this period of time. I remember actually that when was Orange Revolution and after Maidan events, actually there were quite high expectations about raising civic activity in Ukrainian society. All we expected that Ukraine will be changing in terms of creating a new civil political culture. And this civil culture, which was closely studied by two American political scientists, Almond and Weber, supposes that people are actively involved in decision-making, in providing different civil activities, in pressing on politicians, policymakers to defend their rights, to promote some very important, socially important initiatives and stuff like this. From your opinion, person who is herself actively doing this work and actually promoting this kind of civil culture, do you think that during last years Ukraine has been changing really in this direction, or it's just a wishful thinking that we are just see several important examples of civil activity, but in fact in the majority Ukrainian society remains passive and not active in these civil terms? What is your opinion?
Thank you very much for your question. Gennady, our organization had one project. It was project how to strengthen civil society in Ukraine, and we worked with 25 NGOs, and 15 of them we create a coalition of NGOs after this project. Not all, of course, not all. But I'm really proud that we implement so many democratic instruments, and our citizens, active citizens, they're involved in the process of decision making. They're really ready to struggle for our values, democratic values and human rights values. It's very important for all of us, actually. And for example, in Kharkiv region, where we did reform of decentralization and project Dobre, decentralization for effective results. What we see now, these people who were involved in these processes, they're so active, they created hubs, they volunteer, they helping each other. So I think we have really strong civil society sector in Ukraine. And what is the idea of School of Volunteer, our School of Volunteers, that you can volunteer anywhere, and you can work anywhere but volunteer. It doesn't matter what is your activities in life, but you can do input. For example, in a lot of regions, what we support the creation of youth councils, and they are really impressively working. But we understood that, okay, youth is okay, but maybe we should pay attention to schools. And in our even School of Peace, we motivate these children to do their administration inside schools. So we are growing new generation with understanding of mechanisms of democratic instruments. And for example, in 4 regions of Ukraine, we implement participatory school budgeting. So our pupils at schools, together with parents and teachers, they organize different kind of activities, and not only activities, they even have hard projects and even created scientific laboratories. So I think it's really good results, and I think if we will give our energy to young people, as you are doing it, my job is also to do it, we will get results, maybe not so fast, but in several years, we receive, strong civil society in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you.
And
thank you for answering your activity, of course. Thank you.
Nicola,
Nicola.
go ahead.
Thank you, Maria, for your very brilliant presentation, and also especially for your involvement in favor of the society in Ukraine. I would like to ask you a question. Are there different perceptions of gender equality issues depending on the regions in Ukraine? Have you seen some differences depending of different territories in Ukraine?
Ukraine is so huge, so we have not only differences in gender policy, and not only in cultural aspects. We are so huge country, and we have so many differences. But when we work in Donbass area, Donetsk and Lugansk region, we met a lot of people, Greek community. It was in south of Ukraine, Gagauzia, or different, religions. Of course, it's a huge difference on implementation of gender policy. For example, in west of Ukraine, in center of Ukraine, in east of Ukraine, because yes, we had. I will not say it's very easy to implement this policy. No, it's soft power. We are doing this years, so during a lot of years. And for example, what problems do we have gender on implementation of gender policy, especially? For example, in west of Ukraine, we have more religion communities, and some communities are against gender policy. As comparing with progressive center capital, for example, we implement gender policy in Kyiv administration. And now we are working on gender audit. So this is a step forward. But some communities, of course, have their opinion on this topic. Not easy topic for some communities. And it's quite different regions. But what we pay attention in our schools of peace and in our work in Donbass, we do social cohesion events. So we are looking for values which gathering people, not dividing, but gathering people.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Maria. Thank you, Maria, for your contribution and collaboration. We should carry on, and our collaboration should continue. And now I'm happy to present Dr. Krіс Вестон, our all-time friend and also a regular speaker at our conferences. I would say a fixture at our conferences. I think there has been not a single conference that Krіс would miss. It's an honor and pleasure to have you with us. And Krіс is going to talk about, surprise, surprise, Wallerstein and the geopolitics of world system.
Good. Well, thanks. First of all, thanks very much, Pablo, for inviting me. And a big sort of hello to everyone. Sorry I can't be with you in Kiev. I'm looking forward to the time and opportunity when I can come and see you. It's also good to see Gennady Korzhov there. I haven't seen him for a few years. He's still looking very well and young and sprightly. And Maria, I just want to say to you, frankly, after listening to you, I view you personally as a real beacon of light and hope in somewhat dark and bleak times. So I really wish you all the best in those future endeavors. I really do. I came in towards the end of a conversation between Gennady and Nicholas, where you were talking about French intellectuals. I had occasion a few days ago to listen to a well-known French expert, Thomas Gaumard, who was giving a speech to the Brookings Institution entitled Russia, France and Global Disorder. And he himself raised the whole point about French citizens, intellectuals having difficulty getting to grips with the war in Ukraine. And his basic answer to them was, look, in effect, it's a colonial war under nuclear cover. And I think that sort of silenced some of his friends who were raising a few doubts about what was going on. But I think hopefully we may well yet come to it when we talk a bit more about Emanuel Wallerstein, about his own view. And it's interesting, his comments in his own blog that he used to do up to the time he unfortunately passed away, where he does talk about France and Germany and the connections, deep connections with Russia, and where he thought that was going. Maybe we can deal with that in the sort of a follow-up. I don't know how can I get hold of my presentation, Pavlo? So I thought it was going to come up automatically. No? Okay. Well, sorry.
I can help you. There is a green cube on the bottom.
Yeah.
It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 4. And this is a demonstration of the screen. You should press this demonstration of the screen.
Okay. It's not a share screen, is it?
Yeah, share screen. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, share screen. Yeah.
And I'm looking for.
And you have to find your presentation somewhere on your computer.
Okay, so bear with me a minute. Thanks very much for the introduction, or the advice.
You should have
just coming up now. Is that up?
Not yet.
Okay.
You should have opened your presentation on computer in a separate window.
Yep. I've got that here.
Okay.
Okay.
Excellent.
Does that work?
You almost.
Participants. There you go. Participants can now see your application. Is that good for everyone?
Well,
okay.
You're almost there. I think you have just to press enter or something like that to open the presentation.
Hold a minute. Okay, you are screen sharing.
Yes.
Is that it?
No, you have not started your presentation yet.
Okay, all right. Well, look,
we can see your folder, the list of your documents, but the presentation has not started yet.
Okay, all right.
Did you open it in a separate?
Yeah.
And then I think, well, it depends on your computer. On my computer, you should hit preview.
Preview.
Yeah, if you have this option on your computer. Like that. But if I want to run presentation with Zoom on my computer, I have to open it and then go to share screen and hit preview.
Okay. There we go. Is that working?
Yeah, excellent.
Okay, sorry about that. It just goes to show my technical ineptitude. So if I can just kick off with a bit about Emanuel Wallerstein. He born in sort of 1931. I think he sadly passed away about 4 years ago. He was a sort of a sociologist, historian, economist, and also a writer on geopolitics. He wrote quite a long set of blogs on his views on the world, really up until the point he died. But he's probably best well known for his 4 books on the world system, which he wrote between 1974 and 2011. And unfortunately, he was going to do another 2 books, but I believe he sort of never really got round to doing them. And I think he just sort of did various articles. But if I was to just set out what the key assumption and almost his findings, almost what perhaps our American friends would call the key takeaways from the world system, I would sort of set them out really on this slide here. And at the heart of what Emanuel Wallerstein was really trying to do was he really wanted to understand the global inequalities, and he basically believed that required thinking on a global scale. He challenged modern science through his concept of a historical social system, and by that he sort of encapsulated it in his own sort of thought, which he expressed, which is that all systems are historic and all history is systematic. And in his view, society was not just equated with a particular country or a particular nation state, but rather was on a larger scale of a social system, which he viewed as, the world as a unity, as a unit of analysis, the world in totality. And therefore, at the heart of it, what he was saying is, well, look, if you're looking at, for example, the United Kingdom, you can't just, in terms of its economy, you can't just treat it in terms of just what goes on within the United Kingdom. You also have to look at what it was doing around the world and what ties and foreign investments and trade relationships it had and how it impacted upon other parts of the world. Now, as part of his historical background, Wallerstein essentially said that since approximately 1450, the social system had been essentially a capitalist world economy. Now, his sort of views on this are encapsulated in his sort of background. He had a background in sort of very heavily influenced by a French philosopher and writer, Fernand Braudel, who talked about the sort of long waves. And within sort of Wallerstein's books, you'll see sort of concepts of sort of like the long 16th century or the long 20th century. And in fact, just to take the latter as a sort of an indicator, he was sort of basically saying that the 20th century, as far as he's concerned, lasted from, or would last from, the sort of the middle of the 19th century all the way up to 2050, which is almost like midway through the 21st century. And he sort of applied this sort of analysis throughout most of his works. But in essence, the 1450 is quite an interesting timeline because, strictly speaking, Marxists would take the view that, sort of capitalism was sort of really only sort of took place in sort of 19th century and then rippled out from the UK into Europe and beyond. But for Wallerstein, his view was that capitalism was more of a sort of not just a mode of production, it concerned also the accumulation of wealth and also the international division of labor. And he looked to essentially the 1450 as being around the period when it was becoming a capitalist world economy, and that, you know, where people had sort of maximized what they could achieve in agriculture, they were looking then to, you know, exploit other areas outside of their own country. And therefore you had sort of in historical terms, the launching of the Portuguese, you know, travels of navigation, and then Spain, the occupation of the Canary Islands for growing sugar. All this was the sort of the start of what he viewed as being the sort of the capitalist world economy, and leading into the sort of almost the colonialism that had been practiced predominantly by European powers, that sort of took capitalism all around the world and led to the exploitation of the various colonies and the extraction of materials for the benefit of Europe. And he came in with this sort of hierarchy, which is the next point, which is the sort of almost a division of the world between the core, the periphery, and the semi-periphery. And in very broad terms, he would call the core as being United Kingdom, Western Europe, United States, and the periphery and the semi-periphery as being what in essence is either the undeveloped and developing countries of the world. And the semi-periphery, which is a somewhat sort of slightly vague, he viewed as being those countries that were essentially more wealthier than the periphery, but were essentially still intermediating between them, the periphery and the core. And, you know, I think one of the examples he would have given would be something like Imperial Russia as being falling within that semi-periphery. As part of the sort of the core, he sort of looked at essentially how that sort of dominance had progressed throughout the course of history. First of which would be the Portugal, and how essentially that drifted, that leadership got taken on by the Netherlands, and then ultimately by Britain around about the 19th century. And now we effectively have the United States and China now in the lead, or both contesting the leadership, with very much the Europe and the UK in decline, but possibly still holding their status as core powers. Wallerstein also was stressing the importance of economics as a form of material power. And as I've just alluded to, you know, that power has been maintained by the core countries for quite a surprising period of time. I think we could probably talk almost for a couple of 100 years. He was also essentially saying that primary geopolitical powers are hegemonic powers. And in terms of the United States, and he sort of portrays the United States as really reaching hegemony really after the Second World War, when the United States essentially controlled almost 50% of the manufacturing output of the world after the war had come to an end. But he viewed the United States as being in form of a structural crisis since around about 1968 to 73. He called it essentially the US going from a sort of a dominant hegemon into essentially what he called hegemonic decline. Those dates are quite interesting. I mean, 1968 was the sort of cultural revolution going on throughout the world, whether it was sort of the youth culture and changes in sort of human, well, sort of feminism, sort of human rights more coming to the fore. Whereas the other bookend, the 1973, was essentially when the core countries were facing the crisis in part due to the oil crisis in the Middle East and the oil embargo placed upon what was essentially the periphery, the Arab-based periphery in terms of supplying cheap oil to the West. He also, Wallerstein points to sort of economic strength, translating into a dominant influence in global trade and finance. And he really posits the sort of main ideology as being centrist liberalism, as coming to an end around about the 1968-73. We may well come back to that in a moment, because they, you know, what he is essentially saying is that, you know, that sort of centrist liberalism as a sort of held fast, but was being challenged in the late 60s, early 70s, and it was being replaced by something different, what we would call probably now neoliberalism. Now, one of the things that Wallerstein also talks about is this achievement of hegemony through economic innovation. Now, I'm just going to sort of say that, you know, we look at the sort of the first industrial revolution as really being dominated by Britain in the coal and iron and steel. And I've actually put in these dates, 1760 to 1840, as being roughly when that was starting to take place. If you read Wallerstein, Wallerstein is very, you know, is not happy about this sort of setting of dates. He believes that the Industrial Revolution started far earlier, that it was sort of almost a sort of more or less, wasn't quite as delineated as those strict dates. And I have a certain amount of sympathy with that, but it's the 1840 that I think that he disputes, where I would probably proffer an alternative, that actually the 1840 was becoming quite a critical point for how that revolution had played out. And I would just refer people to the economic historian Angus Madison, who authored Contours of World History from 1 AD up until 2030. And in his sort of work, he basically was saying that, look, you know, okay, they were both largely agricultural economies, but they still had the sort of manufacturing of the day, which was in textiles. And certainly by the end of the 18th century, they were both still, by virtue of their populations, major contributors to global output. China and India both basically had what is essentially almost 30% of global output together. And that 1840 becomes quite a critical point, because it's not just that the revolution had taken effect, that it revolutionized the way people did business and manufactured goods, but it also becomes a bit of a cutoff point for what you consider as being what happened to India, whose share of economic output would be diminished not only by the Industrial Revolution in Britain, but also by virtue of the fact that Britain had essentially colonized India over the latter part of the 18th century and even well into the early 19th century, and essentially was swamping the Indian economy with its own output, which was textiles, which ravaged both society and the economy. And if we turn to China, the 1840s is around about the time when the First Opium War was being fought. And again, Chinese economy would come under the sort of the pressure of foreign predators of not just Britain and later France, but other countries over the course of the 19th century. But returning back to the Wallerstein's point about sort of hegemony varying through the sort of economic innovation, if we now look at the early 20th century, we see the advent of automobiles and the aviation and the chemicals. And the two major players for that would be the United States and Germany. And Wallerstein talks about both the US and Germany essentially fighting a 30-year war, which goes from what was 1914 up until 1945, when Germany was obviously clearly defeated. and the United States had come out on top. If we now look at the late 20th century, part of it really, Wallerstein doesn't really cover within his works, but we can see the third revolution of electronics, the digitalization was essentially very much dominated by the United States. But now we have a somewhat different state of affairs with what's going on with the fourth revolution. And the fourth revolution we can talk about in terms of artificial intelligence, robotics, supercomputing, and biotechnology. And the two big players, without a shadow of a doubt, in that respect, because I sadly view European Union as not being a major participant in this new set of technologies, is the US and China. And what we now see is how that is being sort of playing out in terms of so-called trade war, and the sort of growing tensions that are sort of capturing both countries, one of which, China, has got its own economic issues and its own slowing growth, and its demographic dividend now no longer worth much as the population falls, but also the United States, as it's still trying to recover from essentially an incomplete economic recovery after 2008. And what we can see right now between the two parties is the sort of the geopolitics, geoeconomics, that's arising also through their interdependency. And I think the one thing that I would say about Wallerstein is that comes out from virtually all his works is that, and this is one of the reasons why the sort of the world becomes a unit of analysis rather than a country, is purely because we're so intertwined. And that's, you know, if we look at the supply chains that have built up, the Apple being the classic example of the product being designed by the United States, but assembled in China, but with certain components from China, but a lot of it coming from other countries, which is Germany, or the semiconductors coming from Taiwan or other places. That, you know, these supply chains have become so intertwined, therefore we're so interdependent. And what we're now seeing, certainly with the United States, who wants to maintain its position of hegemony, is how it sort of controls the new technologies and how it's restricting the Chinese competitors from challenging its predominance in that sort of range of new technologies and innovations. And therefore we can see examples of the banning or restricted usage of 5G, of Huawei. But not only, I mean, it also extends to other parties. TikTok being well known as, I think, one of these apps. It's a favorite application of my son, who uses it for his sort of cartoons or creating cartoons. But not only, TikTok is also one of the largest global payment mechanisms. And clearly that is viewed as a threat, particularly in the West, that it might encroach upon their own dominance in finances. Matter I might just come back to in a moment. But also the US, and not only the US, but also Britain, I believe, is looking very closely at Hikvision. Again, this sort of cheap, sort of camera networks, but now being viewed with certain amount of suspicion because of their ostensible use in places like Xinjiang for monitoring not only the Muslim population, but also the wider Chinese population as part of the Indian state controls. So, you know, there's all this sort of dependency, interdependency and interrelations and intertwining going on in the trade. But it's the one aspect which I think Wallerstein perhaps doesn't quite spend too much time on, is this whole issue of the capital market independency. Yes, we can look at the sort of the trade of goods and services, which can be in the sort of the hundreds of billions. I mean, we know that Chinese imports in the United States were all subject to tariffs. And I think the figure involved is $600 or $700 billion that were subject to tariffs. But if you start looking at the independence of capital markets, we can come away with some quite significant figures. This figure of $5 trillion is the interdependency between the US and the Chinese capital markets. $5 trillion. That figure is something of the order of about a quarter of US GDP, probably almost a third of Chinese GDP. So we're talking significant figures. And therefore, you know, when we're talking about how the common expression we hear these days of sort of decoupling or friendshoring, you know, we sort of have to step back and think about, well, what does that really mean when we start talking about a capital market independency of something of the order of a quarter of US GDP. That figure, by the way, comes from Kevin Rudd, who's the former Prime Minister of Australia, who's written a very good book called The Avoidable War. Now, I've alluded to the sort of certain issues, but if I was just to sum up the issues with Wallerstein that I think are pertinent for consideration, you know, one of which is, you know, he's argued within his books that the USA is in a process of hegemonic decline. I put that as being a bit of a debatable, question mark, contestable. We know that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, 89, and the fall of the Soviet Union, 91, there was what a lot of geopolitical experts have called a sort of a unipolar moment where, you know, United States was almost last man standing. And that we should really contrast that with Wallerstein's own view, who took a far more sanguine view on that development, on those set of elements. He actually says that the fall of Berlin will accelerate the decline of the United States. That's worth pondering as we look about what goes on in terms of, you know, almost a psychological reading of the United States, that it would all go to the heads, and then we would have essentially very the wars fought both against Afghanistan in 2001 and the ill-advised invasion of Iraq in 2003. And therefore, Wallerstein has a point. It should be said. The question, of course, is what the US is now doing evidence continuing of its hegemonic decline, or is it essentially a wake-up call in terms of how it proceeds and why it's taking certain steps vis-a-vis China? There is also some issues with Wallerstein in terms of the sort of subject, you know, whether there's a logical problem of historical determinism. And of course, the question over predictive power. I mean, he does talk about the sort of the US essentially being partly in hegemonic decline by virtue of the fact that it was about to face defeat in the Vietnam War. It's worth bearing in mind, of course, that Vietnam is now an ally of the United States in how it confronts China's growing power in the Indo-Pacific region. But again, you know, Wallerstein does have some points. I mean, you know, there are some wider issues arising from that. I mean, the United States became somewhat reluctant to get engaged in particular conflicts, but certainly in 1991, when it went into Iraq, the first Gulf War, over Iraq, you know, I can remember very clearly the discourse was that, you know, the United States had put the ghosts of Vietnam finally behind it. But that in turn had led to very countervailing forces. And if you read sort of Dosh's book on The Long Game, which talks about China's grand strategy and how it sort of views itself in the world and its concerns about the United States and where it wants to go. You know, the Gulf War, together with the fall of the Berlin Wall and also the collapse of the Soviet Union, led it to reconsider its position and how it approached the United States further compounded by events of Tiananmen Square. And that led to how it proceeded going forward in the world, how it wanted to convert its wealth into military power, how it sort of started to stake out its claims in the Indo-Pacific. And now where we are right now, with China seeking to be a more global player. There's also this sort of structural determinism that's been alleged against Wallerstein. And what's interesting is in one of the sort of the authors of a book on geopolitics is that, you know, the sort of assertion that Wallerstein ignores agency, which is quite interesting because if you look at Wallerstein, he himself argues that capitalism itself was determined by agency. That Europe could have gone through a very different way back in the 15th century. It didn't have to go down that route, but it was human agency that determined the path by which Europe took in terms of its development of a capitalist economy. And then the other issue that, you know, has been sort of asserted is that the very much the analysis is Eurocentric. But, you know, again, I would sort of perhaps take issue with that in saying that the world system itself evolved almost independently from any particular empire or state. And it was essentially directly connected to European colonialism. So I'll just hold it there. I think, you know, I hope I look forward to receiving questions from the audience if they're interested in talking a bit more about Emanuel Wallerstein. But I'll happily vacate the floor to my esteemed colleagues for their views and hopefully critical feedback. Thank you, Pavlo.
Thank you, Chris. It's been as brilliant as ever and as topical as ever. Questions, comments from the audience, from our participants? Okay, Alexander Korol, go ahead.
Thank you. Some thinkers, they when they thought about what happened now, for example, in Ukraine, they said that there's our war with Russia now, it's just a bell of something greater, the bigger battle between China and America and United States. And is it prove the theory of Wallerstein that now we had this fourth revolution, we have two different states that means to be the center of world economic system, and now they are controversial, can be solved only by war. What do you think about that?
Thank you very much for the question. I think there's a couple of things that I would feed into that response. I think it's quite if I just go for first point of reference to Wallerstein, it remains quite clear, although it's probably not expressly stated by him. But if you look to how hegemonic powers have given way, it has generally been historically through war. So if we look at how the Netherlands, the Dutch Republic, sorry, gave way to Britain, it was really as a consequence of the war. Britain came out on top also against France. What's interesting also is that the United States came out on top in 1945 as a result of a wider war between Germany against both Britain, which was still quite a dominant power, albeit it had effectively been very badly taken, had suffered tremendous losses as a result of the First World War. So we had this interim period where almost the United States was a dominant world power, but didn't really want to take responsibility for that dominant role until 1945. And we start to drift into the sort of Graham Allison, in his book, he calls it the Thucydidean trap, Now, that book itself has been slightly misportrayed because what I think you should really take away is that war is never inevitable. It's part of what Kevin Rudd is saying in his book. It isn't, wars can be avoided. However, be conscious of the fact in history, generally, hegemonic powers have arisen through war, and that is how it's happened. People, that's how the people take the position, and the previous hegemonic powers sort of retreats into the sort of darkness, as it were. Now, if I just turn with the pertinence, the current position of the nature of the question, let us be very, very clear about some of the timelines. It has been quite clear to a lot of people from outside that the Russian-Chinese partnership has developed very closely over the last decade. It is certainly no, how would I phrase it? It was not a completely coincidence that President Putin turned up in Beijing not much more than 2 to 3 weeks before the war to essentially sign a whole raft of agreements and a partnership with no limits with China. I think everyone is very much of the view that there was coordination. I think that was the reason why Putin went there. It was to see this is what was going to happen. It's going to be a brief war. We're going to walk away. And the fact that that didn't happen is a tribute to the courage of the Ukrainian soldiers, and in putting that plan, devastating that plan that Putin had. Now, I think what has now become more so clear is that China has looked at the reaction of the United States and the European Union and suddenly realized the costs that it might incur by any further additional support to be rendered to Russia. And the China took particular note of the way that the West grabbed a very, very big chunk of Russia's central bank reserves, and looked at its own holdings of $2 trillion, and wondered whether that might not be at risk if it was to go down certain avenues. And it also took note of the great discrepancy in terms of the trade that it was doing with Russia vis-a-vis the amount of trade that it does with the European Union and also the United States, before it came to probably an inevitable decision that while it cheered on Russia from the sidelines and waffled its way into sort of, we may well help at an appropriate juncture, but it's really nothing to do with us. I think China's been very much caught cold by the reaction, and itself, in the view of many people, is rethinking what its own intentions are vis-a-vis Taiwan. Because while there's a very superficial discussion, or has been a superficial discussion going on, that Taiwan is, an integral part of China, but it's not the case in the Ukraine, because the Ukraine was a separate country. Be clear, I mean, Putin's comments yesterday, where he talked about the reclaiming of the lands, historic Russian lands, i.e., what was essentially part and still is a part officially of Ukraine, is clearly a matter, now of grave concern to everyone. And I think, just to allude back to the conversation, the point that I made just prior to the speech, when I was talking about Thomas Gomar, I mean, very much the takeaway from that is Europe needs to wake up, because its main principal advantage of comparative advantage of peace now no longer exists, with the inflagration that is now taking place, well, just next door to Poland. because Poland is where I live. Hopefully, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Gennady Korjov and then Stanislav August.
Hi, Gennady. How are you? You're looking very well. Totally
fine.
unchanged since I last saw you a few years ago.
Yeah, really. Thank you very much for your kind words, actually. You look great as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure not only to see you and, of course, to hear your presentations. It's a pleasure. Thank you for your presentation. Really interesting. Actually, my question is a kind of continuation of the previous one by Alexandra about really these changes in geopolitical positions of the participants of this conflict, or rather this aggressive war. Russia, as you said at the very beginning, actually, characterizing this war, can be considered as a last empire probably on the earth. It's and it rages this colonial war, actually, in fact, against Ukraine. And is this a kind of, I don't know, last chance of the last empire to hold its positions and to continue to lead this colonial policy, and through this colonial policy to hold its position on this international arena of international relations. Yesterday, actually, we had a talk with Professor Derlugian about his, I would say, ideas or speculations about what is going on to be after the end of the war, actually. And he suggests that countries which, he said, dispossessed, which after the collapse of the USSR were on the periphery of this world system, should unite. And he actually, for me, it was very strange. He listed countries like Russia, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine as well, among these possessed, who can actually unite in order to get more voice, more strength in this international arena. On the other hand, Golavacha, for example, talked about Huntington's propositions that it's very strange war between countries which belong to the same civilizations, this orthodox civilizations. And I just want to hear your opinion about what you think we are heading for, and what will be the result of this war on geopolitical terms. It's evident that now we are in the situation when already this geopolitical chess, how it's called?
Chessboard.
Exactly, It's changing. But what is your expectations? What do you think is going to be later on?
Okay, let me break it down a couple of things, because you've alluded, I think, very to Huntington, and also good colleague Georgie. I have a few views on that. A view that in part has been influenced by Wallerstein, but not only. I think, the one thing I would say about Wallerstein, and also a person who I'm sure you'll remember, he's certainly viewed as a sort of almost like a national hero in Poland, is Zbigniew Brzezinski. His son actually just lives up the road from me. He's now the ambassador to Poland from the United States. But Zbigniew Brzezinski authored a book on called The Grand Chessboard. And his basic proposition was that Russia can only be defined as an empire if it holds Ukraine. Now, I have a considerable amount of sympathy with that particular reference, with that particular point that's been made by Brzezinski. I think it's very important. I think it's the importance of that has been belatedly recognized perhaps by Poland, albeit it was quite heavily involved, as I'm sure you recall, in the Orange Revolution, but I think it's been rather somewhat concentrating on domestic events until essentially the last, well, since the invasion took place in February. But if I was to just talk about Wallerstein for a moment, I think one of the things that I took away from Wallerstein's work was that he was also a very good macro geoeconomist, and I sort of slightly alluded to this, right? Talk about when he talks about the importance of economics as a material power. Now, what I would say is that some of the motivations for the war can be, yes, can be the sort of empire and the colonial, but I don't think some of the more material economic factors should also be ignored. And one of which is, several, let's be quite clear, concern demographics. I believe the figure that Russia, the population dropped by 1 million surplus deaths under COVID. If you look at the demographics, Gennady, one of the only few increases in the Russian population that has taken place over the better part of the last decade is because of the occupation of Crimea. If you look at the figures that that's, I think the figure was maybe a couple of million. That was the only reason why the Russian population has increased. And what you've got is a continual decline, in a demographic decline, which is going to very badly affect Russia and has probably been exacerbated not only by COVID, but is certainly going to be even further exacerbated by not only the casualties that it's incurred in this ridiculous war, which unfortunately Ukraine is paying the price for, but also the mass emigration of its essential future, of its future intellectual capital. Because the figures of people who have left Russia because they now no longer see a future is considerable. And they're all washing up in Turkey or Armenia or even Tajikistan or some of these other stans as they get their sort of connecting flight out of it. So, I think those problems have been exacerbated by the war. What I think you've also got is, and I know this is a source of considerable frustration for both your President Zelensky and also Ukraine, but not only, is the incredibly stupid reliance and dependency. And again, of course, come back to the Wallerstein interdependency issue, but the dependency of European Union on oil and gas and other hydrocarbons from Russia, which it should have long sorted out, but it failed to, in part because nation states thought they could cut their own deal. And I have a concern, I think I alluded to it earlier, and Wallerstein, interesting enough, has written about it in one of his blogs about this sort of, German and French coziness to Russia. I think that you start to look at that now with a certain amount of, caution going forward. In terms of, Russia, where Russia goes, look, because I think it's quite important. I think Russia has exacerbated a number of problems, adverse factors. It thought it was probably going to overturn the order, the international global order, by a quick 3-day blitz into Kiev. That's clearly the plan that came awry due to, I said, the bravery and courage of Ukraine. And I look on Russia future with certainly a certain amount of despair. I did spend 2 years in Russia, but I think I just query about its future. I think, the oil and gas may well keep it going, but, there is a sort of climate change targets, even by good old China, 2050. Any oil and gas is being bought by China and India at massive discounts to world prices. So, the future doesn't look bright. Now, in terms of Ukraine, when this war comes to an end, as all wars must come to an end, I think the costs of reconstruction are going to be massive. I think the issue of Ukraine coming into the European Union is certainly going to be quite a significant area of debate going forward. And I think, there's going to be a lot of people with varying degrees of, sort of, should we, but what are we going to do to offer? Because clearly part of the problem was that Ukraine became no man's land from about 2008 onwards. That was a big problem, and that problem was created by, I'm sorry to say this, but by the French and Germans, and continued long past its sell-by date, and frankly still going on. So I think that would be the sort of concern that I have as to how, going forward, the French and the Germans are managed, and by when Ukraine will become a full member of the European Union, and how its interim status is regulated. Those are really critical. But to look at a bigger picture, everyone in Washington is viewing the Ukraine war as part of a China challenge to the global order. I mean, I don't think that should be mistaken. It may well be viewed with, or interpreted with a certain amount of nuance or whatever, but I think everyone views the Ukraine conflict in a probably a very more serious fashion than perhaps is what is going on in Europe right now. And again, I allude to the French and the German issues that are arising. And I think this is why, the Washington will certainly continue to be a major supporter of Ukraine. I think Poland very much will also continue, and also Britain. And the rest of Europe will see how things go, as it were. But I said, I think everyone views this in Washington as a sign of effectively the global order coming under serious threat. And let's be quite clear. I mean, I know your president has been invited to the NATO meeting in Madrid, but he's not the only person who's being invited apart from NATO. There's also, I believe, representatives from Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand also going. So the problem facing NATO is not just the war in Ukraine, but it's also the China problem. And I think that's where matters are going to be going, come what may, even when the war finishes, which I hope will be sooner, but to the benefit or to the advantage of Ukraine, I definitely hope that will be the case. But that seems to be the way the world is going right now.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Okay.
Thank you, Stanislav.
Yes, hello.
Hello, Stanislav.
Do you think this conflict can simulate maybe some change in reforms in the European Union? Maybe it can start process of similar to the centralization, and the EU can become some sort of federation, super state. No, can Lisbon 2.0 agreements possible?
So thanks very much for the question. I will just state my clear conflict of interest in advance. Well, I am a Brit. I am intensely supportive of Europe. I'll make no bones about it. I think the UK leaving Brexit, doing Brexit was not a good idea. I've always been a firm believer in the European project for as long as I can remember. Look, right now, you know, I know again, it's very difficult for people, particularly in the Ukraine, to understand, because you know you are facing sort of you know, an existentialist threat from Russia. But right now in Europe, we have, frankly, a lot of issues still washing over from the populist votes that were taking place. So, I mean, I have to be quite cautious about any further reforms in the European Union right now. I think for any number of reasons, one of which is, you know, where is the leadership in the European Union right now? I mean, Angela Merkel, whatever may be said about her leadership capabilities or the decisions that she made, and I say that with particular pertinence to what is being now faced in Ukraine, did lead the European Union in some manner or form. I'm afraid to say the German Chancellor is still new to the job. I think he's under a lot of pressure. I think his rhetoric, or at least his actions, have not met his rhetoric. I think he's under a lot of pressure from his coalition partners. I think he's under a lot of pressure in Germany. I'm not sure there's going to be much ambition from Germany. If I look at France, for the person who was only saying 3 or 4 years ago about strategic autonomy, I'm afraid to say I don't think we can expect that much leadership from President Macron. President Draghi, you should be very clear, I think his whole sort of prime ministership is very much in serious doubt, and I think you can probably expect announcements of an election by early next year at the latest. But I think he's generally viewed as a sitting as a sort of a what's the expression, you know, he's not going to be able to achieve anything. You know, he's just about to see the term of his office slowly coming to an end. There's not much leadership, and therefore I don't really see much ambition. I think most people are also trying to focus on the cost of living crisis, because inflation is quite high. It's certainly probably nowhere near what it is in Kiev, in Ukraine, but you know, these are historic levels of inflation being faced, cost of living. I have to say, even in Poland, I think as attention starts to switch to, you know, how can they maximize the EU recovery funds, which virtually most other European countries are also doing. Again, I don't see, and by virtue of their Eurosceptic stance, I don't see anything coming from that end. So I think for the moment, I just don't see any leadership taking place that's going to take the European Union further. I think there will be certain adjustments in terms of what happens with the energy security, but you know, they are contending with, you know, opposition from Mr. Orban in Hungary. I just don't see it. I would like to see a little more leadership. I don't think it's going to happen. I think I've outlined the reason why I don't think it's going to happen. I will be the first to throw my hat up in the air if it changes, because I think Europe needs leadership. I mean, it's just not there, and it's a tragedy. I really believe that. Now, how much the UK could have done is one of those great might have beens, which I'd prefer for various reasons not to go into. But you know, I just think that the European Union is going to go sort of sideways while it sort of fixates on the issues that it faces internally. And I have to say, this is a big worry, because there are other, you know, grand issues coming up, not just in Ukraine, but bigger issue of how we start to put in place some form of policy vis-a-vis China, which is definitely out there. But I think because of low bandwidth, it's becoming difficult for people to attend to even that. I mean, we don't have a strategy. Let's be very clear about it. We don't have a strategy, and we don't really have much of a vision, unfortunately. But, you know, life, hope springs eternal, if I can finish on a more optimistic note.
Thank you. It's very sadly.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Thanks for all the questions. I'm sure there are lots more, but we are behind the schedule. So really grateful to Chris.
Thank you, Pavlo. Great to see you, and thanks for inviting me. Thanks very much to everyone, and I really wish you all the very best in Kiev, Ukraine, and look forward to being with you.
Thank you, and we should stay in touch and get back to this subject because I'd like to discuss it more. Perhaps you could conduct a separate seminar on this issue for our faculty and students, and of course everybody is invited.
I would be honored to. I'd be honored to, Pavlo.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And right now, allow us to have a 5-minute break. We'll switch between computers. So I'm going to stop recording.